Howdy and welcome to the Strange West Podcast. This is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trent Tano. Bringing us in as always with their rendition of Eno Marconi's For a Few Dollars More is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. If you like your guitar slingers like you like your gunslingers, then head on over to MitchPolzak.com. That's Mitch, Polzak.com. And in tonight's podcast, we continue the Cowboys Vs Nazi adventure in Chapter 16 of Paris, High Noon, by yours truly, Trent Tano. You can pick up a paperback or an ebook copy today at ParisHighNoon.com. Get all your Cowboys Vs Nazi action today at ParisHighNoon.com. Paris High Noon t-shirts, sweatshirts, and other swag are available at Society6.com/Trentano. Both Paris High Noon and Mustache t-shirts are available at Society6.com/Trentano. And as always, a big thank you to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and his talent to the podcast. He really does bring Paris High Noon alive. And so without further ado, here is Chapter 16 of Paris High Noon.
Chapter 16, The Borderline. With each degree down the Massif Central, the outlaws could see the warm green valleys of Aquitaine. The Vizier River emptied into the Dordogne Valley, with castles perched high on the yellow cliffs, as the water rushed to the Garonne River. Gravity helped the pace of the horses, which were getting their wind back. Like the men, the stable-bound horses of Chateau de Medivet had worked off the fat of their relative idleness and become the lean beast nature had intended them to be. And if Catfish was the standard by which the French brigands measured their outlaw profession, then the Black Arabian set a high thoroughbred bar. He was all horse, and the old cowboy wasn't shy of putting the stud through the paces. The Arabian took the commands of a master horseman as only a stallion of his level could obey. The pleasure Catfish took in riding cured some of the old cowboy's weariness as he led the gang off the mountains. It had been over 3 weeks since crossing the Loire, and the supplies from Normandy were low. Luckily, there were hundreds of farms and gardens along the foot of the Petites Pyrenees, where the gang filled their bellies with poached cabbages and carrots. Caught up on sleep, and their fear of starvation waning, the brigands' thoughts rose to their natural level of women and wine. St. Jude finished shoveling the last of the tinned meat stew into his mouth. "We're close," he said, with his mouth full. "I can smell that sangria from here." "I'm smelling those senoritas," Quick Billy said. He lifted his leg and let out a fart that could be heard down in the valley. "We should keep going," Jean said. His plate was half full, as if he'd taken to watching his back more than feeding his gullet. "We shouldn't risk a town." "Who the hell made you boss?" said Hammer, whose agitation was returning along with his strength. He let out a belch for good measure. "You're boy enough to be satisfied drawing on your pecker, but for the more experienced, we need a lady's touch." "Boy, I tell you," Louis said, "you could line up 99 whores, and I'll fuck them all until my balls turn blue." "I doubt you got that much prowess," Hammer said. "Although, I wouldn't mind taking on the challenge myself. I once had 3 North Africans at a hashish bar just off the Saint Germain," Louis said. His eyes went misty from the memory, as if he'd just took a hookah full of hash to his lips. "I'm surprised they didn't cut your throat," Quick Billy said. "Those Arabs don't take kindly to Christians fucking their women." "I'm surprised I didn't cut theirs," Louis said. "And I bet the old Arab that pimped them out was their dad." Quick Billy gave a nervous laugh, licked the stew from his plate. About the only two who didn't talk about whores were Barnaby and Jean. Jean was silent for the obvious boyish reason of ignorance, while Barnaby's silence was deliberate. As a young man, he had done his share of courting country girls with flowers in their hair and healthy smiles on their chubby faces. But the years wore on, and the girls found happiness in the arms of others, leaving Barnaby with his farm and all the work that went along with it. The next 2 decades of storms, droughts, wars, and political and economic calamity had replaced his desire for women with a pipe full of good tobacco, clear night skies, and picking up an opera out of cane from an old radio. A night in a small town with whores wasn't high on his list. But to sit and maybe listen to an opera and smoke something good from a pipe did have its merits, as far as Barnaby was concerned. "Well, I guess you boys deserve a roll in the hay," Catfish said. The French outlaws were green when they took the hard trail to Spain, and for the most part they went through the adventure like seasoned cowboys. Truth was that the ride across France had been more of a trial than the old cowboy thought it would be. Even a younger Catfish would have had a time of it. A night, even a brief one, in a feather bed wrapped in the warm glow of women and whiskey, would be worth the risk. Sean still had his doubts, but didn't express them. Catfish put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Well, son, I guess we'll die with our boots off." By dusk they were off again, following the river bays which cut down from the Collines d'Armagnac. The dry, cool air gave them a break from the heat and humidity of France's lush green valleys. High above, the Pyrenees cut the horizon, their peaks still sprinkled with patches of snow like the heads of worn-out old men. The terrain reminded Catfish of the Rockies, thick conifer woods, lush meadows, and cool lakes that spread over hard stone. They reached the outskirts of Miranda by nightfall. The town was just a handful of stone buildings with red tile roofs. About the only sign of life was a weak light coming from a rough and ready 2-story building with a faded sign. "How do you know that's the whorehouse?" Sean asked. "It ain't the church," Hammer said. "Or the post office," St. Jude added. "If it ain't the place we're looking for, we'll just apologize and ask for directions," Catfish said. The outlaws rode up the street like derelict moths, pointing their tired mounts to the light. Every door they passed was shut, every window barred. Only a low, trembling symphony from the crickets and toads could be heard. Catfish took a look around. Miranda didn't seem much different from the small mining towns that sprung up instantly and died out just as quick back in the Wild West. Folk in those types of environments tended to mind their own affairs as long as travelers spent their money and took their trouble with them on the trail in the morning. Still, Catfish figured on paying up front to be cautious, rather than paying off his debt in some gray bar hotel. "All right," Catfish said. "Here's the plan. Hammer, you and Louie go up the far side of the road and keep your eye out. Jean and Barnaby, watch the near side. If you see any headlights, give us a hoot." "What about me?" St. Jude said. "You and Quick Billy go knock on the door. I'll watch your backs from the trees." "Why us?" Quick Billy didn't like the notion of walking through front doors since it was his nature to sneak in through back ones. "I figured you boys for being the most experienced at whorehouses," Catfish said. St. Jude balked. "I'm sure that shriveled-up turnip you keep in your pants has been inside more snatch than all of us put together." "That's true, but I've also shot more men than all of you put together, and I doubt you could hit anything in the dark." St. Jude shrugged his shoulders. The two brigands moved out and made their way to the lit house. Some fresh sheets with stubborn stains still hung on the laundry line, and the smell of sour wine wafted through the air. St. Jude rapped the door. No one answered. After the third knock came a reply full of feminine heft. "Go away, we're closed." "Let us in, mon chéri," St. Jude said, in his best imitation of a gentleman cocksucker. "Come back in the morning." St. Jude snickered. What kind of whorehouse closes? Through a small slot in the door appeared the business end of a double-barreled shotgun. "I guess all that cum has backed up into your ears," the woman said, moving the barrels of the shotgun from side to side. "Keep it up, and I'll clean out your whole head." Look, St. Jude pulled out a wad of Reichsmarks. We want booze and snatch and ain't particular in the order. If you don't want our business, then tell us who will. The shotgun went back inside and was soon followed by the sound of metal on metal. The front door opened. A stout woman with 2 fistfuls of bosom and a thick mop of steel-black hair held her shotgun on the 2 outlaws. What about that old man hiding in the bushes? He's supposed to be watching our backs, St. Jude said with a touch of agitation, and not doing a very good job of it. The woman laughed. I thought it might be you. Where's the rest of the crew? St. Jude put on a puzzled expression. What are you talking about? He was a horrible liar, especially with women. The woman laughed again. You must be the dumb one. She leaned the shotgun against the wall and waved at the night sky. Come on in, you rascals. Quit sulking around like the thieves you are before someone that gives a damn notices. Catfish made it in first and tipped his hat. Good evening, miss. Her face lit up. Ah, so it is you. Catfish laughed. Well, madame, I hope I'm not the man of your dreams, otherwise you're living a nightmare. I'm Big Colette, she said. Can I help it if a man of your reputation leaves me a bit in awe? Big Colette laughed, put her arm around Catfish, and kissed him on the cheeks. The others came in, leaving the horses hobbled up in the woods. She led them to the kitchen. A large table with plates covered in greasy fat and cold scraps greeted them. The smell was thick on their tongues. Big Colette shouted upstairs. Soon 2 girls came down in slips that showed a generous amount of shoulder and bosom. They didn't look a bit ashamed. The girls broke out about a 6 bottles of wine, and the gangsters took their pull straight from the bottle. Catfish took a seat near the madam. You'll forgive our manners, Catfish said. We didn't have much back in Paris, and the trail did little to improve 'em. Big Colette pulled out a cigarette and slid a gold lighter into the old cowboy's hand. Be a darling, she said. Catfish lit her cigarette. Big Colette took in a long drag, held it like a secret, and blew it. The Bande Sauvage. The gang had the look of a bull that had just got buggered, while Catfish's mustache stretched from one ear to the other. Everyone has heard of you, Big Colette said. You're the biggest thing to hit since the fall of France. Here. Big Colette got up and returned with a week-old newspaper from Bordeaux. St. Jude and Hammer fought for it so fiercely they ended up ripping the front page in half. Hammer began reading his section. On the 15th of July, just before sunrise, a spectacular robbery occurred in Argenton. Hey, Quick Billy said. He got up and leaned over Hammer's shoulder along with the rest of the gang. That's us. No shit, you fool, Hammer said. Shut up and let me read. Hammer cleared his throat. There were many casualties as the robbers engaged the defending German soldiers, killing a number of them. Shit, St. Jude said. They make it sound as if those Bosch bastards were the good guys. When was the last time you wore a badge? Catfish said with a laugh. St. Jude ignored the sally and read his section. After blowing up the bank's vault and making off with over 100,000 Reichsmarks, the wild bunch of robbers rode off on horseback, disappearing into the Norman Hill country. St. Jude looked at the gang. I guess it's official, boys. We're famous. The others went through the papers, reading the story so deeply one would figure they weren't even there. They knew they were going to make a scene robbing the bank in Argenton the way they did, but they never imagined they would make front-page news. Catfish sat back and chuckled at the gang, almost drooling over their printed exploits. You boys shouldn't believe those lies that come off a printing press. Quick Billy was hopping like a June bug on a skillet. They called us a bunch of wild brigands, he said. They said we took out a whole company of Bosch. Do you think we took out a company of Bosch? The men looked at one another. In all of the dust, din, and gunfire, it was hard to see anything. They can't get everything right, Quick Billy said, and continued to believe what he was reading. It was a strange opiate that Catfish had been addicted to back in his early outlaw days. Like God himself had stopped managing the universe and taken notice of something his smallest creation had accomplished. Of course, making the papers did have its drawbacks. Going after the Germans the way they did would get their wanted posters printed up double time. Like Butch said, once someone starts noticing you, they tend to start wanting you. So what now? St. Jude said to Big Colette. You turn us in for a big fat reward? Big Colette smiled and took another drag of her cigarette. Mon ami, I'm used to taking risks. And I'm also used to getting rewards. It's a big risk taking you in. I want a cut of that money. St. Jude smiled back and placed a large wad of Reichsmarks on the table. I guess we patriots have to stick together. Big Colette shouted up the stairs. Come on down, girls. Business is about to pick up. The whores came down and put their bare arms around the outlaws, with most of the young men stuck on the other side of the Rhine and the married men stuck with religion, at least during daylight. Most of the action had died down at Big Colette's. During the Spanish Civil War, she did brisk business with all the smugglers headed to the border with guns and ammunition for the Republican cause. But Colette hadn't seen a bunch of big spenders like these since Pétain took over Vichy. About the only one who didn't get his pecker wet was Barnaby. The Norman announced he would look after the horses in the abandoned barn Big Colette offered. Jean got up to go with Barnaby to take care of the horses in the barn. Where in the fuck do you think you're going? Hammer said, and put a fresh bottle of red in front of the boy. Jean looked at Catfish, who had his hands full with Big Colette. St. Jude put a full glass in Jean's hand. Jean raised it timidly. Hammer grabbed the chair and tilted it back so the wine splashed into Jean's mouth and down his throat, almost choking him. St. Jude and Hammer laughed while slapping Jean's back. Enough of the wine went down into his shrunken stomach for it to give him a warm feeling. You'd think by the way he's carrying on, this was his first taste of wine, St. Jude said, and poured another glass. Jean smiled and took a big quaff. He was no stranger to wine, but grew up content to take small sips from near-empty bottles. Quick Billy and Louie sat across the room with a whore on their laps and glasses in their hands. Before going upstairs, Hammer and St. Jude pulled Louie aside. You keep it under control, fuck hard, but not too hard, St. Jude said. Once we get to Spain, you're on your own. Got it? Louis sneered and nodded. He hated everyone in the gang, especially the old cowboy. Catfish was quick. He seemed to know when trouble was coming and be ready for it. Louis hadn't learned that trick, and doubted he would live long enough on his own to apply any lessons. So he stayed his dark desire and waited. St. Jude waved a fan of Reichsmarks. Hey, girls, which one of you is going to break in my little brother's saddle? Jude laughed, feeling more and more like a cowboy. The girls rushed over to Jean, grabbing his crotch and licking his ears. Jean didn't know what to say, let alone do, when it came to picking out whores. He had no experience with them, even in Paris where he saw them from time to time, but was too shy and nervous to look their way. Now they were throwing themselves at him, a situation Jean quickly liked. Finally, a square-headed gal won out. I'll take the boy, she said with some weight. Don't be gentle, Marion, St. Jude said with a laugh as the whore dragged Jean upstairs. It's going to take a lot of booze and snatch for him to forget his country. Marion closed the door behind her, shutting out the laughter. Inside, a worn-out mattress lay atop a rusty frame. A candle nub and wash basin sat on a broken dresser beside the bed. She sat down on the edge of the bed with her slip still showing generous amounts of skin. Jean continued to stand, not knowing the proper thing to do and far too shy to ask. What's wrong? Marion said. She took Jean by the hand and looked up into his droopy brown eyes. Just tired, that's all. I would sure hope so. It's a long ride, even by train, from Paris to the Pyrenees. You did it on foot and horseback. How are things up north? Bad, Jean said, and that's all he wanted to say about it. Even in Paris, Jean's eyes dampened like morning dew on a desert day, especially in Paris. I've never been to Paris, Marion said. Sometimes a trick will leave some fashion magazines with pictures of the city. It seems so big, almost as big as the mountains. Jean laughed a little. I wouldn't say it's that big, but it's big. Marion let her tits fall from her slip. All right, Paris, shuck off them boots. Jean bent down and lifted his leg at the same time to pull off his boots. A dizzy spell came over him and he almost crashed into the dresser. You going to be able to do this? Marion lay on her back with the slip hiked over her hips, exposing her bushy sex. Jean stood still, feeling his pecker get hard. I'm sorry, it's just that I've never done this before. Had a whore. Had any woman? It's okay, Marion said. You got to learn sometime. Normally, I wouldn't even let you take off your boots, but since your brother is throwing money around like the King of France, I'm willing to make the exception. After all Jean had been through and all he'd seen, he found himself failing this latest test of his manhood. He could not bring himself to move. Marion got up from the mattress and sat on the edge. She grabbed his pants and pulled him close. She unzipped his fly and popped the button on his pants, which fell around his ankle. Jean looked on with horror and fascination while Marion dipped a small washcloth in the basin and then started to rub it on Jean's half-hard pecker. By the time Marion was done, Jean's head was in a slight spin, while his member throbbed in a strange equilibrium of desire and pain. Then, to the young boy's shock, Marion put it in her mouth and sucked like it was hard candy. Jean looked up at the ceiling while attempting to pull all the air out of the small room into his lungs. He felt a tingling sensation down in his nutsack, much like when he had those pleasant dreams of moo that left him wet the next morning. Looks like you're ready, Marion said. To be sure, Jean was ready, and he fell onto Marion with the inexperienced excitement. The two flopped around, making the bed springs moan. At times, Jean's pecker would flop out until Marion decided she needed more control of the greenhorn and mounted on top. She bucked and ground all over John's groin, while her big breasts slapped his face in blissful recrimination. Finally, Jean had that feeling from when he dreamed of moo, and he wetted himself on Marion's belly. The square-headed whore laughed and wiped herself with the washcloth. I figured you would have come when I was sucking you off, Marion said. I guess it's the wine in you. Jean lay on his back, thrilled and exhausted. How long had he been living until this moment he wasn't sure. Now, as the room dimmed around him and the groans and knocks from the other cribs faded, Jean finally felt like a cowboy. Well, Paris, Marion said, as she fixed her slip around her curves, I hope you learned something. Catfish lay on his back looking up at the ceiling that shook and trembled from the pear in the bed above him. His chest heaved and hoed from an exercise he hadn't enjoyed in quite a spell. A patch of silvery chest hairs glistened with perspiration, trailing and thinning on its way down his belly. Big Colette snored gently on her side. A smile twisted on her lips where the pillow smothered half her mouth. Her blouse was pulled down to her belly, while her bloomers were pulled down to her ankles. In the low lamplight, Big Colette reminded Catfish of a Parisian lady who hung around Pershing's headquarters handing out coffee and pastries to the doughboys. Whenever Catfish walked out of the gate, she put on a big smile and handed the cowboy the largest croissant. They waltzed the city together on his nights off. coming in the next day worn out and rode hard. The staff officers didn't much like it, but there wasn't much for Catfish and Lee to do during the first few months, and the two cowboys took advantage of whatever pleasures they could get away with. Then Pershing moved the AEF headquarters to Charmont near the front lines. Catfish left Paris without saying goodbye and soon forgot her name. Catfish turned his head, looking at the peaceful slumber of Big Colette. He wondered if he would forget her name as well. So many names of faces and places had blurred or evaporated through the years that Catfish didn't bother keeping count. He held on to some while letting others go. The memory of Lee was less of a burden now, but his mind was still on Hiccup. He knew the odds were long, so long even the Creator wouldn't lay money on them. But when he recalled the days and months and years he'd spent wondering about Lee's fate, Catfish knew he had to try. He was going to die anyway. He might as well die for a friend. First, he had to get Jean and the rest to the border alive. After that, he would go back for Hiccup, alone. It was suicidal to go back to Paris to break out Hiccup. Even with an army, Catfish couldn't ask anyone from the gang to go back with him. Hiccup was Catfish's responsibility. He couldn't live with any more men ending up dead because of a decision he made. Even so, Catfish weighed asking St. Jude or Hammer to come back with him to Paris. Catfish could use a man who knew the Parisian underground, as the old cowboy might have a tougher time asking questions. If it came down to a choice, he preferred Hammer. Not that St. Jude wasn't good enough. Catfish was afraid that if St. Jude went back to Paris, then Jean might too. Catfish let out a sigh. He knew how much the boy looked up to him. Jean would follow him all the way to the gates of hell, and then a little farther if asked. Yet Catfish couldn't ask Jean to go back with him to Paris. Jean might be the best rider, roper, and the surest gunfighter that Catfish had seen in a long time, but he was still a boy. Jean still had a chance, even a small one, to live out his life as much as a normal human being could after going through such a war. It wasn't right for a boy that young to kill men and be hunted down like an animal, just as it was wrong for him to lose everything he knew and loved. Big Colette let out a snort in her sleep, kicked her leg, and then went back to a low, mellow purr. Dawn was breaking, leaking weak light through the torn curtain. The outlaws would be gone before the sun peeked over the mountains, and in a few days they would reach the border, where each man had to make a choice. Catfish had to respect each man's choice. La Bande Sauvage might not be the best in a saddle, but they lived hard, traveled fast, with wads of money in their pockets, and enough dead bodies left on the trail to keep the undertakers in Normandy busy. Each one of them earned the freedom that they were getting closer to. The question was, could Catfish respect Jean's choice? Catfish let out a long sigh, rolled over to Big Colette, and wrapped his arms around her. He closed his eyes, enjoying the small moment for what it was, until the rooster crowed. About the only ones that looked fresh in the morning were the horses and Barnaby. He had them saddled up and ready to go by the time the outlaws slunk out of the whore cribs. It took a couple of pots of coffee, along with a nest full of eggs and a pigpen's worth of bacon to get the men moving. Jean still felt like a mule had kicked his head, and the others seemed to have the same affliction. Big Colette made sure they had enough provisions and bottles to make it to the border, and then some. The whores even came out to see them off. Catfish tossed another wad of Reichsmarks to Big Colette. "Thanks again, madam, for all that you've done for us, and the kindness you showed us. You should come with us to the border. It might be safe to stay there." "Merci, mon cowboy," Big Colette said, "but there's too much competition on the other side of the Pyrenees for a girl looking to make a living on her backside." Follow the bays for another 10 miles, she said, pointing southwest. Then cut east along the Collines d'Armagnac until you reach the Petites Pyrenees. Follow the Salat River onto the mountains. You'll find an old smuggler's trail leading into Spain. Throw some money at an old Republican smuggler named Blanco. He'll get you to where you want to go. Catfish tipped his hat to the ladies and spurred the Arabian on its hind legs. The stud let out a cry, and in the dust their horses' hooves, La Bande Sauvage was gone. They rode for the next 3 days into the high alpine ranges and valleys, where cool water rushed through the sparse meadows and woodlands of the mountain's eastern face. Some parts of the trail were tough, especially the steep Massif de l'Iris, but they had the wind at their backs and took on the mountain passes like cowboys going up the Chisholm Trail. They could taste the free Spanish air on their tongues, and not even the snow-covered peaks of the Massif de Nouvelle dampened their spirits. By the 4th day, the outlaws approached the invisible line between war and peace. As St. Jude and the others started to cross into Spain, Catfish reined in the Black Arabian. "You boys keep heading south along the river," Catfish said to St. Jude. St. Jude turned his horse around. He looked at Catfish as if he'd just swallowed a turd. "You're not coming?" Catfish shook his head. "I got some unfinished business back in Paris that don't concern you boys." "Then why did you come all this way?" Hammer said. "Had to get you all out of this safely." Catfish pointed towards a cut in the mountains. "Just keep riding, and in 5 minutes this will all be over for you." Jean was so shocked to hear Catfish's proclamation, he almost fell off the saddle. "But there's nothing left for you there," Jean said. "My friend is still there," Catfish replied. "I can't leave Hiccup to the Boche." "Your friend is probably dead," Hammer said. "Don't be a fool. You can't make it back to Paris alone." "He won't have to," St. Jude said to the surprise of everyone, even himself. "I'm going back with Catfish." Catfish smiled and shook his head. "Thanks for the support. But Hiccup ain't your responsibility. He's mine. I got him into this mess, and I'll get him out, just like I did for you boys." Catfish looked at St. Jude, nodded at Jean. "You two are all you've got left in the world. Watch out for each other. And when this war is over, y'all can go back to Paris." Catfish looked at the rest of the gang. "You've all done more than any man still free in this country could do. You boys don't have to prove anything to anyone. Go to Spain with a clean conscience. You earned it, along with my respect." The blood rushed out of Jean's face, and his forehead broke into a sweat. "But we can't make it without you." "Jean, I've taught you all that I could. You've proven to be man enough to choose and suffer. But I don't want you coming back to Paris." Tears leaked out of the old cowboy's eyes and ran down his cheek. "You think you're the only one who left a loved one behind?" Jean yelled. "My mother and Moo are back there. I left them there. I don't know if they're still alive, dead, or held by the Boche. How can I live with myself if I don't go back?" The whole gang turned and looked at Jean. None of them expected him to stand up for himself, let alone to anyone else. Jean had found his pride. Catfish hoped the boy wouldn't die trying to prove how much of it he had. Catfish swallowed. His mouth felt dry and his throat scratchy. "Son, what happened to Patrice could happen to you. Your feelings are justified, but getting killed isn't going to help your mother or Moo." Jean's mouth trembled at the memory of his pard. "Don't you use Patrice as a reason for me not going back. He took his chances just like we all did." St. Jude rode up to Catfish. "It's no use," St. Jude said. "Me and Jean are going back with you. The only way to stop us is to shoot us, and as hard of an old son of a bitch as you can be, I don't think you will. Catfish nodded. All right, then. You've all earned the right to decide. But like Hammer said, it's going to be more dangerous than robbing a bank and killing a handful of Bosch. So if anyone wants to come back to Paris with me, you can. But I don't want no belly aching or second thoughts. This could be the last decision you make. Hammer wiped his face with his hand. He wasn't an honorable man by any stretch, but he felt bound to go back with Catfish. He'd feel a coward if he didn't. Yet he had lived long in a hard world by knowing when the odds were too great, and his pride allowed him to be a coward from time to time. Hammer looked around at the rest of the crew. What about you, Quick Billy? Quick Billy glanced at the rest of the gang and said, Hammer's right. The Bosch play for keeps, and I'm not interested in losing what little I have. At least one of you fucks has some sense, Hammer said. How about you, Barnaby? The big Norman shook his head. I'll go back. For Barnaby, the decision wasn't about running away from the law, but what he was going to do in Spain. He didn't take to fancy restaurants, fine hotels, and sweet liquors. All he wanted was his little cottage farm where the breeze of the channel cooled the afternoons and salted the night air. If going back meant dying, then dying was what he aimed to do. Louis, Hammer said. Got a warrant out for me in Madrid. It was a weak excuse, but the way Louis saw it, if the Germans caught him, he could use Catfish's head to save his own neck. He might even get a reward out of it. But it wasn't just the thought of slipping through the noose or filling his pockets that drove him. Louis wanted to see the old cowboy die. He would do it himself, but he had about as much chance at taking out Catfish as Jacques did. Catfish nodded. He figured Louis had earned his right to make his own decision. Only Jean had reservations about letting him come back. He had hoped that Louis, like all cowards and killers, would take the easy way out. By God, Hammer said, I can't believe we came all this way for everyone wanting to go back. He looked at Catfish and stuck out his hand. It has been an honor and a privilege, Catfish. I can die knowing I rode with the best. Catfish took Hammer's hand. Good luck. May the rascal that has been watching over you all this time keep up the scout. St. Jude rode his horse towards Hammer. He stuck out his hand to his old rival. Bonne chance, mon ami. Hammer took St. Jude's hand and smiled. Bonne chance. Each turned in the direction of his destiny. For Hammer and Quick Billy, it was south towards the setting sun, sangria and senoritas. For Catfish and the rest, their journey lay north, where darkness and old friends waited.
And welcome back to the Strange West podcast. Once again, this is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trent Tano. Well, that about does it for the Cowboys vs Nazi action in Chapter 16 of Paris High Noon by yours truly, Trent Tano. Can't wait to find out what happens next? Then head on over to ParisHighNoon.com. Both paperback and ebook are available at ParisHighNoon.com. Paris High Noon t-shirts, sweatshirts, and other swag are available at Society6.com/TrentTano. Both Paris High Noon and the Mustache t-shirts are available at Society6.com/TrentTano. And another big thank you to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and his talent to the podcast. He really does bring Paris High Noon alive. And sending us out with their rendition of Eno Morricone's For a Few Dollars More is the Mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. Please check them out at MitchPolzak.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Till then, happy trails.